So we basically can't talk about organic matter and soil health and nutrients and all the good stuff we've covered without talking about how do you actually make compost. It seems pretty logical. You throw some stuff in a pile, you forget about it, you come back to it. That's how the forest does it, right? But it's actually, there's kind of an art, there's actually definitely an art and a science to composting, but we can keep it pretty simple for a home situation. And as long as you're not trying to produce compost for sale, it's okay if it's a little bit variable for home garden use. But what is compost? It is actually the result of what happens when you aerobically, I know it sounds like exercising, but when you think about it, when you exercise, you breathe in and out real heavy. I know I do, but that's because I don't exercise enough. You breathe in and out real heavy, and all that oxygen is what helps your body run. When you aerobically compost something, the way that things are degrading in the presence of oxygen, the resulting material, that's what compost is. It is material plant solids aerobically degraded. I know it sounds more sciencey than necessary, but if you think about it, it's basically open air decomposition. When you're thinking about looking at compost, let's say you've made a pile, you've been throwing random stuff like grass clippings, food waste from your house and your household, your kitchen, and different things like that in there. Even sometimes people will compost animal bodies, like a chicken gets killed by a fox, they'll throw the whole chicken in the compost. All different materials that are thrown in the compost. If you can still tell what those materials are, your compost is not done yet. I always say if you can stick your hand in your compost, pull out a handful, and there's still just big chunks of stuff, it's going to need at least 6 months to form a proper usable product for your garden. And like I said, visually, you'll be able to tell this pretty quickly. Your compost should basically be like sweet smelling dirt. Not sweet like delicious cake mix like I have mentioned a number of times, but sweet in that kind of leafy smell that you get when you're crunching through a fall forest, and that sweet decompositional smell kind of rises up out of the earth to meet your nose on a crisp autumn day. That is the smell you're going for. You want it to imitate the smell of basically finished soil. And that's how you know your compost is ready to add to the garden. In the meantime, though, let's talk about how to properly make a compost pile and determine whether or not your compost is aerobically or in the presence of oxygen decomposing. There's a lot of different ways to make a compost pile. I think the easiest and the cheapest way is to take 3 wooden pallets. I get these for free all the time on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or anywhere really. They give them away on the sides of the road a lot. And they don't even have to be unbroken. If they're missing a few slats, it's okay. You can wire 3 of them together, like a square missing its front, in which you will dump all your compost stuff into. You can add wire on the front if you want to keep animals out of it. But honestly, where I live, I've never really noticed or really minded if animals got in my compost. To me, it's kind of like an offering to the forest. So I like to pile grass clippings, kitchen waste, and all other types of organic matter. But there's a general rule of thumb you can follow to help make sure you don't have too much hot stuff that's going to anaerobically or too wetly compost versus dry dead stuff. An easy way to remember it is greens versus browns. Just like in organic matter, there's the living, the dead, and the very dead. Compost is kind of imitating that process of becoming organic matter, literally. So you need to add some dead brown stuff with your hot living green stuff. And that makes sense, because otherwise your compost will get too hot, too wet, and will actually anaerobically or without the presence of oxygen in those wet, compressed spaces, and it will smell bad and produce an undesirable, stinky, sticky product. So what you need to do is generally go by the rule of, they say it's 25-to-1 or 40-to-1 browns to green. So 1/3 parts green stuff that's still kind of living, 2/3 part brown dead stuff. That's kind of the cheat sheet. Every time I dump my kitchen compost into the compost pile, I throw a handful or 2 of straw or dead leaves or something very brown, dead, and dry over that. And I try to do it in that same ratio. So if I put let's say 2 cups of wet kitchen compost, I'm going to add 2/3 as much dry leaves, twigs even, things like that. On top of that, it also helps with the smell if you add things like very, very dry mulch or leaves or straw over your wet, stinky compost from the kitchen, and that really helps. Composting animal manures is also really easy to do in a less stinky way By every time you place, let's say, your horse manure into the compost pile, lay a layer of straw between the layers of living green raw manure. That's going to help provide air spaces for bacteria to move through and water to move through. And it's also going to help provide spaces for bacterial relationships to be formed to more quickly degrade that manure into a usable soil product. So remember, 1/3 green, 2/3 brown. And that's going to be your carbon to nitrogen kind of ratios, which is super helpful when we want to just kind of quickly assess if we need to add more dry dead stuff to that living wet green stuff. And that's a great way to start making a healthy compost pile that we're going to allow to compost for 6 months to a year. Different animal manures have different recommended compost times. For my horse manure is one of my preferred types of manure, despite the fact that it can sometimes be a little weedy because it doesn't take quite as long to compost as, say, cow manure. Cow manure, if you've ever seen a cow poop, you'll understand, is a little wetter than horse poop, and that's why it takes longer. Once again, we're always going for that aerobic or oxygen-fueled decomposition, so wetter manures need more fluffy, dead, dry stuff to help create pore spaces for proper decomposition. So compost is kind of magic in one, it's kind of an alchemical process to go from icky manure to magical soil addition. And the way that it does this is actually through chemical reactions. An immense amount of heat is produced by compost. If you live in a place with lots of livestock, in the early mornings, on cool autumn mornings, you may have ever, if you go outside, notice the steam rising out of the manure piles. And this is because sometimes these compost piles, whether or not they contain manure even, will reach up to 150 degrees when they're in their thermophilic or heat-loving stage. This is basically the middle stage of composting. Our first stage of composting is called the Mesophilic stage, and this is when the compost is just warming up. This is when it's kind of young, and it can kind of take a few weeks to really get up to the 120 to 140 degree ideal temperature range for compost. If you get really nerdy about your compost, you can actually buy a giant thermometer to take the temperature of it. But generally speaking, if you stick your hand above or even in the compost, depending on what it's made of, you can feel how warm it is. And if it's too warm or too cold, turning it or aerating it can kind of either help jumpstart it by inducing more microorganisms into it, or cool it off a little if there's too much stuff concentrated in one area that's causing kind of a heat sink. So turning compost a couple times a season is something you don't necessarily have to do, but it can help more evenly compost your pile. And like I said, it's an incredible heat source, so some people have gone so far as to harness this heat for different things. I've even heard of a composted hot tub where somebody gathered the heat through different types of tubes and things and funneled it into a metal hot tub. So it is an incredible amount of heat, and you do have to be aware of that. So turning it and even taking advantage of it is a really cool idea for your compost pile. Compost needs to have a consistent level of moisture, but it's kind of a delicate balance because you don't want it to be too wet or too dry. Compost needs to be aerobically decomposing, meaning you want oxygen in the presence of all the little critters that are decomposing all that good stuff you've put in there. Grab a handful of your compost and squeeze it. If water comes out like a sponge, that's too wet. If you can see visible droplets, that's too wet. You want to make sure you're either going to cover your compost sometimes if you've been getting too much rain with a tarp or some roofing tin, or if you feel absolutely no moisture and it's bone dry to the touch, that's too dry. You want it to feel gently moist but see no visible droplets, and that's an easy way you can do a basically hand-done compost moisture test to make sure your compost is decomposing appropriately. I also want to share with you guys how I build my compost piles. I said before, I like to use pallets. They're readily available and they provide firm, sturdy walls to really make a big pile in there that's going to create enough mass and matter to really get a pile warm. I always like to begin the pile on bare earth. This is going to allow worms and nematodes and microorganisms to come up through the soil into our compost and really get it going. What I normally will do is I'll kind of scratch up the earth a little bit with a rake or another tool, and then I'll begin layering dead wood like twigs, sticks, sawdust, or mulch. This almost provides an airspace layer to prevent too much wet, waterlogged compost from getting smashed onto the ground and preventing easy movement of those little critters into the compost pile. I then will basically lay a layer of straw that's dry down and begin piling my wet and my dry bits of compost. I'll lay my kitchen compost that's wet down, and then I'll add a layer of browns. Like I said before, the ideal compost is 2/3 brown, 1/3 green. So every time I add any type of living matter like green grass clippings or fresh animal manure, I'm going to add dry sawdust or dead leaves or dead straw as my brown to kind of counteract and prevent that from getting too wet. Like I said, an ideal compost is aerobically decomposing, so I need to make sure there's enough room for oxygen to easily move around and through my compost pile. As I continue to layer it up, eventually at some point I'll hit the top and I'll kind of cap my compost. I live in a community with 13 people, so you kind of have to make it very clear which of the 4 of our compost bins is in action and which one is resting. When I cap a compost bin, I usually stick a little wooden sign on it that has its date of last compost edition. And I know from that date, it's going to be 6 months before I could probably use that compost. And depending on what I've put in it, it may take longer, up to a year, if I've added a lot of manure or bones to it before I can see that it's totally decomposed. And I'll know my compost is ready when I see that it is sweet smelling, it looks like soil, and it is not too wet. Once again, to do that moisture test, you just squeeze a handful of the compost. If water droplets visibly come out of it, it is too wet. And if it feels bone dry, it is too dry. I want it to be moist to the touch, but not so wet that it will yield drops of water when squeezed. Aside from composting kitchen scraps, I think one of the most unsung magical things you can add to your garden is rotten leaves. Leaf mulch is my most favorite addition to the garden. It may be because my favorite vegetable is a sweet potato, and sweet potatoes, unlike regular potatoes who are in a different family in Solanaceae, they don't like as much nitrogen as potatoes do, so they love leaf mulch. Leaf mulch I think of as a natural soil conditioner. It's basically instant organic matter that is not too rich in nitrogen because it's made of decomposed, already dead leaves, the very dead aspect of our organic matter mix-up. And you can make a leaf pile that's basically 4 foot tall by 3 foot wide, and I find this to be the adequate size to allow for proper decomposition to a fluffy kind of soil conditioner-like material. To make the material available, what I do is I take chicken wire and I make a big circle basically that is 4 foot high by 3 foot wide, and I just start piling leaves that I rake up from my yard into this wire circle. Every time I throw leaves in, I throw a couple shovels full of dirt over the leaves. This is going to kind of inoculate them with organisms and little critters to help decompose them. Every once in a while, I might take the wire down and move the leaf pile over a couple feet, and through that, I'll have turned it. You can also do the same thing, like I said, to your compost pile. If you want to turn it every once in a while to help aerate it, the leaf mulch pile will benefit from the same. And in a couple months, you will have this awesome, half-rotten, not that stinky, highly usable mulch and soil conditioner to add to sweet potato beds, to cover soil, and to grow all types of things and add tons of organic matter without overloading it with nitrogen to your soil. And that's why I love leaf mulch piles. So leaf mulch is also useful because, like I mentioned before, in ways to get organic matter, you can actually make leaf mulch tea or compost tea to feed your plants. When you water something with an addition of nutrients to it, it's called fertigation. Fertilizing irrigation is kind of how I think about it. It's like permaculture is permanent agriculture. We like mash up words in agriculture, I guess. Basically what you're going to do is take a burlap bag, or I use old feed sacks because I can use them over and over again, and they're porous, but they won't let large particles through. Fill it with fermented, totally rotted leaf mulch that you've been rotting for 4 to 6 months, and allow it to sit overnight or for a couple days even in a bucket of 5-gallon bucket probably of water. You'll see it'll turn pretty dark brown pretty quickly. Some people aerate their leaf mulch to help appropriately cycle all the nutrients around. I don't always do this because I don't have an aerator, but you can stir it with a stick pretty rapidly a couple times a day to make sure it kind of gets all around in there. And then I'll take this bucket of leaf mulch tea and I'll water my plants with it. It's a great micronutrient dose from all those things, but it's low in nitrogen. So it's helpful for things like sweet potatoes and other plants or peppers that don't want a lot of nitrogen. And that's why I love leaf mold or leaf mulch tea. It's pretty useful for those purposes. So you can also make different types of teas to water your garden with or even spray your plants with, other than leaf mulch tea, by making manure teas. And this is the same method. You literally put well-composted manure into a burlap or porous bag, obviously one you will like to dedicate to this purpose for the rest of its life, and basically soak that in a 5-gallon bucket. You can then either spray this tea onto fruit trees and other small fruits or plants as a kind of microbial inoculant. This way, you're basically giving your plants a bit of probiotics that you've made from the soil of the land, which I think is kind of cool. And there's been a lot of research done that shows that manure tea sprays can help mitigate a lot of fungal diseases, especially on fruit trees. So definitely look into that if you are a small fruit grower or fruit tree grower, as it's a cool natural way to mitigate some of the pressure of fungal diseases, especially here in the hot South. When we're adding animal manures to the garden too, it's important to note, they say the ideal ratio of manure, composted manure to square footage of garden is 40 pounds of composted manure to 100 square feet of ground. And so teas and adding composts are two other ways we can use manure in the garden to add organic matter and beneficial bacteria. Cover crops are kind of the final and I think the most complex way of adding organic matter to our soils. I say complex because we do have to steward the life of another being in planting and maintaining cover crops, and also knowing when, how to choose them, when to cut them, and how to incorporate them into our soils. So people cover crop for a number of reasons. One reason, obviously, is to add organic matter, which is our motto and maxim as organic farmers. The other reason is to cover soil from sun. We know now, after talking about nitrogen, that the sun can you can imagine it like cooking off some of the nutrients. When bare exposed soil is cooked by the sun, it also causes rapid moisture loss. So cover cropping you can think of as a living mulch. And some people call them living mulches or green manures because they literally add all that power of having their bodies basically covering the soil to prevent water loss, nutrient loss, and damage from the sun onto the bare tilth of the soil. So you can use a variety of grasses and legumes or nitrogen-fixing pea family members like clover, vetch, and things like that in combination. When you cover crop, there's basically cool season cover crops and warm season cover crops. We also use one of my favorite potassium and phosphorus fixers is buckwheat, a great summer cover crop, which is neither a grass nor a legume, but is a wonderful, fast-growing, succulent kind of stemmed crop that also makes an edible seed, which you can enjoy if you want to get a stacked function use out of your cover crop. And it's very easy to remove. So you'll have to look into what cover crops are going to be suitable for your season, and also which ones are going to be suitable for your region. And there's lots of great resources about that out there online. I like to use Austrian winter peas and oats in the fall and spring and the cool season crops because I love the milky oat tops and I love to eat little bits of the young peas when they come up in the kind of almost like the middle of winter, it seems, here where we have a milder winter in Western North Carolina. So cover cropping basically involves growing a crop in place, cutting it back and allowing it to rot, or cutting it, removing it, and rotting it somewhere else to be added to our soil later. So that's basically the basics of cover cropping, is growing a crop in place with the intention to add organic matter and possibly nitrogen if it's a legume. There's 3 other ways we can kind of finish up our talk on soils today and talk about these final 3 methods of adding organic matter. These are kind of what I think of as ones I don't often see mentioned online or mentioned in books because they're kind of the less glamorous aspects. You'd think manure tea would be the most unglamorous aspect of soil science, but come to find out, I think the trench method of composting or adding organic matter is literally just digging a hole in the ground, putting compost in it, or pieces of wood or sticks or leaf mulch or whatever you have, and burying it. It's the direct application method. Now, this can work if you have a ton of brush or things you're clearing on your land that you need to do something with, and you don't want to necessarily burn it all. The other method you can use, trench method of composting or basically adding organic matter to your soil, is hugelkultur. And that obviously is not an English word, it is German, and is basically making a raised hill-like bed by burying large pieces of even full logs or brush, putting smaller and smaller pieces of organic matter on top of it, covering it in soil, and directly planting into it. Over time, all that wood matter will decompose and create a very bioactive, rich soil bed, and also take care of large pieces of woody material you're trying to get rid of on your homestead. My other favorite method of kind of composting in place is sheet mulching. And this is done here at Wild Abundance a lot. That's where you just layer things like cardboard down with wood mulch, leaf litter, soil, manure, and all types of other organic material to literally build soil on top of soil. And as those things all degrade, they'll kind of call up earthworms from in the maybe poorer quality soil below to come up through to feast on all that good stuff you've been layering in the different piles and create a lasagna-like structure for plants to grow really richly into the soil. Those are all three of those methods, hugelkultur, trench composting, and sheet mulching or lasagna gardening, are all great for new places that you're gardening. You may not have had the years and years of time to layer stuff into a space or had time to make compost, so you can kind of do it in place. So those are my three favorite methods that I don't see a ton of information out about, that are really easy to do in the newer kind of homesteads that we're moving on to, or if you're stewarding someone else's land and things like that, and you want an instant garden, especially sheet mulching. So definitely check out those methods. So once again, thanks for joining us for Soils 101 at Wild Abundance, and we're really excited to have you. It was really great covering things like organic matter, which I hope is your #1 most remembered term from this short lecture, knowing that NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and understanding the difference between secondary nutrients, micronutrients, and a simple, easy way to build compost, and a little bit more about why we cover crop. So just remember, the take-homes from Soil Science 101 are build organic matter, retain organic matter, and create new ways to capture and redistribute organic matter. And I bet you'll have really amazing, abundant, and happy and healthy crops. So happy growing.